Colors of Politics, NRI, on RI Free Radio. Just as the rainbow has many colors, there are multiple opinions and views of the way our state government should be run. Let us be to the point and deliver the truth. It is time to break down the colors of politics.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Colors of Politics in RI on RI Free Radio. Don't forget to hit us up on social media at Colors of RI with Periscope, Twitter, and Facebook. All three locations you can find us. Again, that's at Colors of RI. Thanks for tuning in. And tonight's topic is the death penalty. It's conservatives I did say that right. Conservatives concerned about the death penalty. And we have Mark Hyden on the call tonight. And Mark is the National Advocacy Coordinator with conservatives concerned about the death penalty. I had trouble spitting that one out. He comes most recently from the National Rifle Association, the NRA, where he served as the campaign field representative in the state of Florida. Prior to his service with the NRA, he was the campaign manager of a Republican congressional race in Western North Carolina. Mark has additionally served as the legislative liaison and public affairs specialist with the Georgia Emergency Management Agency and Homeland Security, and as the legislative aide to the Georgia Senate President pro tempore. And I'm sorry if I murdered your last name, Mark. I'm famous for that. I'm horrible at pronouncing last names. Not so good with that. You have quite an array of experience, and so I'm curious if you don't mind starting out with what point did you determine that the death penalty was a topic you're going to get involved in, and why, and then we can go into exactly what it is that you're doing.
Well, first of all, you pronounced my last name perfectly. So most people don't do that. Kudos to you. Most people make that mistake, but you excelled there. But to answer your question, yeah, I used to support the death penalty. I thought some people just flat out deserved to die. There were some crimes that were just so heinous that they were, the only punishment that made sense was death. And I held on to this for a long time. But, as I grew up and I started to pay attention to studies and facts regarding the death penalty, I started to get a little concerned because I found that what the death penalty did in practice oftentimes didn't meld well with my principles. And, Amy, what I mean by that is I'm a pro-life conservative and I support fiscal responsibility and limited government. But the death penalty risks innocent lives. We know this. Over 156 individuals have been released from death row across the United States because they were only convicted. And other people have been executed, even though there were serious doubts regarding the veracity of their verdict. But then I learned the death penalty costs millions more dollars than life without parole. It's led to tax increases, so in no way could I consider it to be fiscally responsible. And, in the end, I'm one of those conservatives that doesn't really trust the government to deliver mail or fill potholes. So I figured, is there anything limited about the power that we give the state to kill its citizens? And no, there's nothing limited about it, and we probably shouldn't trust our government with that kind of power. So that was kind of my evolution as I started comparing the death penalty to my principles. But the last thing I held on to was this notion of deterrence. I had heard that the death penalty protected society by deterring certain heinous acts through threat of the use of the death penalty. But when I looked at the science, I saw that there's no evidence suggesting that it deters. And in fact, when states get rid of the death penalty, their murder rates tend to go down. So after all of that, I started to work with conservatives concerned about the death penalty. I left the National Rifle Association and started doing this work. And, I haven't looked back. I've been able to work with people like Colonel Oliver North, Jay Sekulow, Richard Viguerie, and many other well-known nationally known conservatives who are very against the death penalty because this is a system that is inconsistent with our principles. So in very long form, I hope I answered your question, Amy.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I just was curious where you got into and figured I'd let the listeners learn how you became into your spot. And just to give everybody a little history of this particular topic within Rhode Island was one of the earliest states in the United States to abolish the capital punishment, having abolished it for all crimes in 1852, and the death penalty was reintroduced in 1872, but it was never carried out before being abolished again in 1984. So Rhode Island's been, I guess you could say, in the forefront of this particular topic. And then even in 2011, Governor Lincoln Chafee refused to transfer a murder suspect to federal authorities because he would face the federal death penalty. And he agreed to plead guilty to murder and robbery charges in Rhode Island, where he would receive a sentence of life in prison without parole. But Governor Chafee said that exposing him to a possible death sentence violated the state's long-standing abolish of the death penalty. So, and Lincoln Chafee even had sent in an opinion piece to the Providence Journal about that topic in 2011. So that's a particular topic for Rhode Island. And one other little fact about it is that the last person to be executed by the penalty previous to it being abolished was in February of 1845 on Valentine's Day. So on Valentine's Day in 1845 was the last time Rhode Island used the death penalty. So there's a little history about Rhode Island, but why don't you, Mark, tell us what your group mission is, what you guys have been doing across the country, and what the focus, what do you want the listeners to know?
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed hearing the history of Rhode Island's death penalty, or lack thereof, I should say. I'm a big history buff, but, it was actually Michigan was the very first English-speaking republic to ban the use of the death penalty, and they did so in the 1840s, just a little bit before Rhode Island did it. But, yeah, Rhode Islanders are leaders on this issue, and, Lincoln Chafee and I, we have plenty to disagree about, but, I'm happy that we both agree that the death penalty, we're better off without it, and I'm happy to stand alongside him, if it comes down to it when it comes to capital punishment. But, we don't have good news in every state, unfortunately. I live in Georgia now, and we led the nation in executions last year. I believe that was the first time we've ever done that. And if you look at the kinds of people that we're executing, it's not the worst of the worst. It's not the most heinous. We executed a man with a low IQ. He may have crossed the threshold that actually met the legal standard for mental retardation, which is the terminology used by the U.S. Supreme Court. We executed a lady who became a born-again Christian and counseled her fellow inmates. We executed another man who had been initially convicted 36 and a half years prior to his execution. So this is what our death penalty does. But what it also does is you can look at Lincoln County, Georgia, about 2 hours from where I live. They raised taxes multiple times to cover the cost of a single capital case. It got so out of hand that the county commissioners actually went before the judge and said that they weren't going to pay for this anymore. It was just far too expensive and wasteful. And then the judge threw the whole county commission in jail. And this, I would understand if you didn't think this is a true story, but it is. This is just how crazy the death penalty really is. And from jail, the county commission had to convene a special hearing to ensure their release. So they approved appropriations from jail so that they could be released. But that just goes to show you the high cost. There's human cost too. States like Georgia, Oklahoma, Florida, Texas, and Missouri, they're known for wrongly convicting people and sentencing them to die. And we can point to many instances, especially in Texas, where people were executed who might have been innocent. So there's good reason that people like me and people across the aisle like Lincoln Chafee are against the death penalty. But it's not all bad news. You know, I didn't come on your show to be the bearer of bad news. There's a lot of good happening out there, too. I'm not sure if you heard about this prosecutor in Orlando, Florida, it's an outlier county, Orange County, Florida is. They're known for historically executing or sentencing more people to die than most other counties. Well, she's an incoming prosecutor, Ms. Ayala, and she was, just elected in November. And she made the bold statement saying that she would not be sentencing or seeking death in any of her cases during her tenure as a state's attorney. And I think that's a very brave statement that she made. And, I applaud her efforts. And, she's seeing some of the fruits of that. A lot of supporters are coming out of the woodwork, conservative, libertarian, and liberal, to support what she's doing. And I applaud her in that as well. And she's doing so not necessarily because she doesn't support the death penalty perhaps in theory. She just views it as a public policy failure. And I happen to agree with her. Point to one thing that the death penalty does satisfactorily on a regular basis. Nothing. I already mentioned that it doesn't protect society, it doesn't deter crime, and it's even harmful on murder victims' family members because of the long, drawn-out, complex process. And I'm friends with a lot of people that have gone through this terrible process. And I met this one lady, if you don't mind me digressing for a second.
No, go right ahead.
Nice lady. Very, very wonderful person in Florida by the name of Suzanne Bossler. And she told a story that I was taken aback when I heard. Her father was a minister who opposed the death penalty, and he'd even told his daughter, in the off chance that he's ever killed, make sure the killer is not executed. This is really altruistic stuff. Well, unfortunately, someone did break into where Suzanne and her father were. He was killed, and Suzanne was injured in the process, and it was a horrific crime. But her father didn't want a death penalty, and she wanted to honor his wishes, and she was also opposed to capital punishment. So once she recovered from her wounds, she was subpoenaed to testify against the killer, and she was happy to do that. She wanted justice. She deserved justice. But on her way to court, she was threatened. Not by the criminal defense attorney, not by the offender. She was threatened by the state. From what I understand, it was the prosecutor, perhaps the judge, both pulled her aside, said, Suzanne, we're so sorry about what happened to you and your father, and we know you're against the death penalty. But we're seeking death anyway, so if you get on the stand and you say that you're against the death penalty, we will throw you in jail and we will hold you in contempt of court. So whenever I hear people say that the death penalty is there for murder victims' family members, I point to stories like Suzanne's and many others that I've met over the years, because oftentimes their well-being and their wishes, they're not considered, and that's what happened here. And this is in part why I do what I do. I want government programs to be efficacious. I want them to be effective, and I want them to serve some sort of benefit. So we launched Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty in 2013 at CPAC, and we were inundated by supporters there. It was an amazing experience to be mobbed by so many supporters when we launched. But our goal is simple. We want to educate people on what the death penalty really does. There's this view of an idealized view of the death penalty in theory that works. Well, you can have that theoretical view if you want, because in practice we know that the death penalty is irrevocably broken. And that's the message that we're carrying. We're educating people on what the death penalty does in practice and how it does not work with our principles. And we want to see the death penalty in the end repealed on a state-by-state legislative basis, because I believe that's the conservative way to do it, and I think that's how we can affect the most change.
That's very well put, and for anybody that's just tuning in now, we're talking with Mark from Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. You're listening to Colors of Politics on RI Free Radio. And one other point that I learned, and maybe you can speak a little bit more to, is we have about 12 states where there's been bills sponsored to repeal the death penalty. It looks like between 2016 and 2017. Am I correct on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's great to see this outpouring of conservative support. But when you look at some of these individuals who are sponsoring this legislation, they have individual stories that I just find fascinating. And you can look at Utah. I was born there. It's a very red state. and it's very fond, or I have very fond memories of it. And the repeal sponsor there was Senator Urquhart. He was a well-known Tea Party conservative, and nobody questioned his bona fides as a conservative. But the year before he sponsored repeal legislation that almost passed, he actually signed on to legislation to allow the use of the firing squad in executions. And when he did that, my understanding is that his rationale was, if we're going to have a government program, we should try to make it work. So he supported the firing squad in case they couldn't get the lethal injection drugs. But as he looked deeper into what the death penalty was doing in his state, he found that he believed that Utahns were better off without it. And he pretty much did an about-face. In the following year, he sponsored repeal legislation that sailed through the Senate and nearly made it through the House, but they ran out of time before they could have a vote. So they're back at it again this year, and they will be next year if they come up short this year. So things are moving forward in a lot of these states, and it's being supported by very conservative individuals. You can look at Kentucky. One of their sponsors was Dave Floyd, a friend of mine, and he served in the Air Force. And no one's going to call these people soft on crime or anything along those lines. They're doing this because they want government programs that work, government programs that don't unnecessarily risk innocent lives. They want government programs that are effective, and I think that's very conservative of them to do so. Now, each one of these states it's at a different process or a different place in the pipeline. Some states are closer than others to repealing the death penalty. I would tell you should probably keep your eye out open when you're talking about repealing capital punishment. Pay attention to Kansas. They're doing some great things there. In Montana, I testified there earlier this legislative session, and there's a young up-and-coming legislator there named Adam Hertz, who's a well-known conservative in the state. He's championing repeal there, and for good reasons. He's a bit of a policy wonk, just like me. He likes looking at the data, at the numbers, what he can prove that programs actually do. And what he sees in the death penalty is just your quintessential big broken government program. So these states are all moving closer, but we're active in many of them. And since we launched in 2013, we've seen state-based conservatives concerned about the death penalty groups launching in more than a half dozen states, and most recently in my home state, the Peach State, Georgia, where we had speakers from across the ideological spectrum on the political right. We had, libertarian conservatives. We had kind of your moderate conservatives, moderate Republicans, and even the state representatives who want to end what our state is doing with the death penalty because it's getting to the point that it's beyond defensible. It's just a failure. And that's, I think, at your point, Amy, I think that's why you're seeing so many Republicans not only signing on, but sponsoring repeal legislation to get rid of a government program that doesn't work.
Yeah, look, from what I can tell, I mean, you're way more educated in this topic than I am, but it looks like Kansas has made some significant strides to the point where the Republican Party completely removed it from its platform, and then the Republican Liberty Caucus passed a resolution. So it looks like it's not just within the legislation, but they really made a huge point standing, almost like flag raising type of a statement.
Yeah, that's right. And but it's not just these Republican-affiliated groups, which many of them are moving in that direction or have already taken positions against the death penalty. It's also some of these smaller groups, these Tea Parties, these liberty groups and pro-life clubs that are getting more and more involved. I speak at Tea Parties across the United States, the ones that are, still active. And what I find there is a lot of individuals that are worried about the direction that our country is going. I mean, Tea Parties, they were founded on the premise of they're taxed enough already, tea. And what does the death penalty do, Andy? We know it causes tax increases. But it does worse than that. It places innocent lives in peril. So I find that we're accepted in many of these Tea Party groups. And I've seen the light bulb go off in people's heads when I'm presenting the conservative case against the death penalty. And I've had so many people change their mind on the spot. And, you know, I keep going back to my home state of Georgia, but I spoke to the Georgia Tea Party, which they have weekly meetings. They have been having them since, I believe, 2009. Very active, very influential group. And by the end of it, at least half of the attendees said that they were completely opposed to capital punishment. And the other half, after I spoke with them, they kind of just supported it in theory, but were concerned about its use in application. So this is what we're seeing. It's not just the Republican Liberty Caucus, which is wonderful to have them on board. It's not just Republican parties, which we need them. But it's also the grassroots in these far-right, very conservative organizations that are pushing for repeal and doing so for the right reasons because of its inconsistent standing when it comes to conservatism. And I think it's fantastic that we're piecing together this broad coalition of Tea Partiers, of libertarians, of moderate Republicans, conservatives, and so forth. You know, I already told you, Amy, about some of the supporters that we have. Dr. Ron Paul endorsed our group. I felt very privileged to have his support. But, you know, the first time I met Colonel Oliver North, he told me that he's against the death penalty because not only is it unnecessary, but it's quite frankly dangerous in the hands of our government. So I think it's a beautiful thing when we have a coalition of people that, you know, can include people like Dr. Ron Paul, Colonel Oliver North, and Jay Sekulow. It just shows that the death penalty is so bad that so many people can coalesce around repealing it.
Yeah, it's definitely wonderful that you have the level of support in so many ways that you have, and I really appreciate you going through and explaining things because I'm sure myself, along with many hundreds of other Rhode Islanders, because we haven't had it here, there's most likely I'm not going to be the only one that was not fully educated on this topic because it wasn't something that we thought about within our state. When you get convicted, you're not going to get the death penalty. So it wasn't necessarily something that was even forefront of thought process because it's been off the books for so long. But do you have a link or a specific reference for the listeners, specifically to the point of how it does make tax increases and how for people to go back and to reference these different points that you have? Do you have somewhere to lead people for them to be able to get more detail about your points?
We sure do. Go to our website. It's conservativesconcern.org, and we have fact sheets on everything that I've talked about. And, you know, I've left some stuff out, unfortunately. But, yes, they should go there, sign up to get our monthly email updates, study some of the materials on there because they may be shocked to find out just how bad the death penalty really is. And if they have questions, they can reach out to me directly at info@conservativesconcern.org. But I want your listeners to know one thing. You may be in a non-death penalty state, but the federal government does have that power, and they can supersede, unfortunately, the state if they want to. And if there is a certain crime within your state, there are different statutes that let the federal government to intrude on essentially states' rights and force a capital trial pretty much at their whim. So this is a huge intrusion into states' rights, and it's a problem that I think Rhode Islanders should be wary of.
Yeah, and that kind of references back to Lincoln Chafee in 2011 when it was the federal situation, but he ultimately stepped forward and said he was not transferring that gentleman over. Now, we have 6 more minutes, and I do not actually have any specific questions for you. So if there is a specific topic you want to delve more into, or, I mean, I'm giving you the floor to go have at it. Tell the listeners anything that you haven't already covered that you want to make sure that they can know and learn more information about this topic regarding you.
Well, it's always dangerous giving someone who works in politics the floor because they're always willing to take it and they will use all of the time, and I appreciate that. But yeah, you know, something I haven't really discussed much, and I'm glad that I had this opportunity, is I talked about what the death penalty does in practice and the risks it poses to taxpayers as well as the wrongly convicted, but there's more to it than that. We also should look at who gets sentenced to death and why. Because what you have across the United States is essentially a lottery of geography. It depends what county you commit an alleged crime in. Most counties don't use the death penalty. It's only 2% of all U.S. counties that account for the majority of all death sentences in the United States. So again, it's a lottery of geography. But if you want to be able to narrow it down even further to see who might be executed, look at the race of the victim. If the victim is a white female, the odds of getting an execution or a death sentence are much, much higher than if the victim is an African American male, which to me says that juries find some lives to be more valuable than others. And, I'd love to say we live in a post-racial world, but I think when you see instances like that, you have to admit that we're not quite there yet. But still, there's another element to this, and it's based on economics. If you can afford a private attorney if you're accused of a capital crime, odds are you're not going to be sentenced to die. But if you have to rely on a court-appointed attorney who just can't afford one and have to go through some sort of capital resource center, which is comprised of very good people, don't get me wrong, but they're overworked. So if they can't afford a private attorney, the chances of them being sentenced to die are much, much higher. So what you have is, and I alluded to this earlier in our conversation, is we have a system that they don't execute the worst of the worst. They don't sentence the people to die who have committed the most heinous crimes. They sentence them largely along economic lines and geographical lines, and sometimes there's also a racial component. So if justice is supposed to be equal and blind, I think you can see that in the death penalty there is nothing equal or blind about it. And that's just one of the myriad of problems that we have with today's system of capital punishment.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't have even thought of it like that if you didn't outline it like that, that you can basically track that there is a form of almost racism, for lack of any other way to label it, if there's a showing that you can actually tell male, female, colored, white. That's actually sad. Not surprising, but sad.
It's very unfortunate, but yeah, you can look at those indicators and they can give you a great idea of whether or not there's going to be a death sentence or a sentence of life without parole. And I think we as taxpayers, we deserve an explanation on that. We deserve more than just an explanation, given what our government has been doing with the death penalty. But certainly, someone should answer for this and explain.
Yeah, that's definitely. And so, is there you said Georgia? Was it last year? Is the highest?
Mm-hmm.
So besides, what are the top 3 states that people should be concerned and feel like they maybe might have, Rhode Islanders might have family or close friends out there that they really want to, encourage them to participate in taking action? Do you know what the top 3 states are?
Well, I'll give you a handful, and what you will see is the states that use the death penalty the most are also the worst at using the death penalty, and that's Oklahoma, that's Missouri, that's Georgia, Florida, and Texas. They account for an enormous percentage of wrongful convictions. And Oklahoma has been, in the national news in the past few years because they kept botching executions. In fact, they didn't even use the right drugs when they executed the last person. They accidentally used a chemical used to de-ice airport runways. And, of course, that execution went awry. But Florida has wrongly convicted and sentenced to die more people than any other state. In fact, more than any other state, any 2 states combined that still has the death penalty on the books. And they've had their system struck down as unconstitutional twice in a single year. So, again, the states that use it the most are the worst at using it, and that should make sense because it's an irrevocably broken government program, and when they insist on using it, the flaws that are inherent in it become revealed.
Yeah, and Oklahoma also did a poll and found the majority of the people that were polled were willing to end the death penalty.
Yeah, that's really exciting, and the plurality of Republicans felt that way too. And I've spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. It's a great state, with great stakes. But I spent some time with Marvin Goodman, who's a Republican county commissioner. I've also spent some time with Craig Dawkins, who runs the Liberty on Tap group there, and they're leaders in their own libertarian and also Republican world. And they're very against the death penalty because they've seen what their state has been doing with it. Botching executions, sentencing innocent people to die, and wasting money when those taxpayer funds could go elsewhere, to schools, to police officers, or back to the taxpayers from whence they came. So we have a lot going on in many of these states. And, I think that goes back to what you were saying about 53% of Oklahomans want to repeal and replace the death penalty. And I can tell you, they want to do so for very good reason.
Yes, and it sounds like it. And I thank you so much. Again, everyone, this is Mark with Conservatives Concerned about the death penalty. You have done an awesome job at educating the listeners on this topic tonight. And why don't you go ahead and throw out the ways to contact and get in touch with your group again for everybody?
You bet. If there are any questions or comments, please send me a message at info@conservativesconcerned.org. But if you want more information, want to sign up to our monthly email, go to conservativesconcerned.org, and we have everything there. So, yeah, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from some of your listeners.
Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of Colors of Politics in RI on RI Free Radio. And don't forget to hit us up on social media, Periscope, Twitter, and Facebook at Colors of RI. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.